Today, we're diving into a really powerful and, yeah, pretty controversial idea, one that could completely change how you look at major world events. It's called disaster capitalism. So let's just start with this question, because it's really the core of the whole thing. What if the chaos that we see after a huge disaster isn't just a bug in the system? What if it's actually a feature, one that's designed for profit? The idea that huge crises, wars, hurricanes, you name it, are actually used as an opportunity to ram through radical economic changes that people would never, ever accept otherwise. So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll get into the core theory, the shock doctrine. Then we'll look at some real-world case studies. We'll also dig into the counterargument, because there's definitely another side to this. After that, we'll see how it's all playing out with climate change, and we'll wrap up by looking at this concept of the hollow state. All right, let's get into it. The shock doctrine thesis. Okay, so the term itself, disaster capitalism, was really popularized by the author Naomi Klein. Her argument, when you boil it down, is both simple and, well, pretty profound. It goes like this. When a society gets hit by a massive shock, we're talking a war, a terrorist attack, a huge natural disaster, people are stunned, they're disoriented, they're just trying to survive. They can't push back. And that's the moment, she argues, that a second shock is applied, an economic one. Rapid-fire, radical free market policies like mass privatization and deregulation that would get huge opposition any other time. Now, this idea didn't just appear out of nowhere. The theory traces its roots back to the 1950s, to the economist Milton Friedman and his work at the University of Chicago. Then, in the 1970s, you see what are described as the first tests of this so-called shock therapy, happening under military coups in South America. But it's really in our lifetime, in the 21st century, that this model seems to have gone global. Think about the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. It was seen as a clean slate. Or even at home, with Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And more recently, what's been happening in Puerto Rico, which has led to this whole new industry basically built around disaster cleanup. All right, so that's the theory, but let's look at some of these case studies to see what this actually looks like when it happens in the real world. Iraq. Yeah, the 2003 invasion is often held up as the textbook example of this whole idea. The argument is that the goal wasn't just regime change, it was to use the shock of the invasion to completely wipe out Iraq's state-run economy and rebuild it from the ground up as, well, a privatized free market dream. It was literally called a clean slate. And to kick this project off, an absolute flood of money poured in. The U.S. Congress alone put up an initial $38 billion. And that's before you even count money from other countries or Iraq's own oil revenue. So you've got this massive budget for a giant economic experiment. But the real question, the one that matters, is where did it all go? This next quote, it really gives you a window into the mindset at the time. I mean, you have to remember, in the total chaos right after the invasion, state-owned assets were being looted everywhere. Factories, vehicles, you name it. But for the people in charge of the economic side of things, like senior advisor Peter McPherson, this wasn't a bug. It was a feature. He called it a form of public sector shrinking, a natural privatization. Just incredible. And then there's Afghanistan. A very similar story, but on an even bigger scale. Get this. Washington spent over $113 billion on reconstruction there. Now, to put that number into perspective for you, that is more money, adjusted for inflation, than the entire Marshall Plan. You know, the plan to rebuild all of Western Europe after World War II. Just let that sink in for a second. So what went wrong? Well, this quote from the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, John Sopko, really hits the nail on the head. He's relaying what U.S. contracting officers told him. I get my pay raise not on how successful the program is, it's on how much money I put on contract. So the incentive wasn't to actually build something that worked. The incentive was just to spend money. The faster, the better. The whole system was basically set up to burn through cash, not to actually rebuild a country. Now, you might think this is something that only happens far away, but a very similar pattern played out much closer to home. In 2017, Hurricane Maria just annihilated Puerto Rico. And one of the biggest casualties was the electrical grid. It was completely destroyed. In the chaos that followed, the island literally became known as Generator Island. And the rush to rebuild the grid, well, it led to some absolutely massive and, frankly, very suspicious contracts. Let's just look at a couple of these contracts that really made people's heads spin. First up, a $300 million deal goes to a company called Whitefish Energy. Sounds impressive, right? Well, it was a tiny 2-year-old firm from Montana that had like 2 full-time employees. Then an even bigger one, almost $1 billion, went to Cobra Acquisitions, a company that almost immediately got tangled up in a scandal. I mean, you're in the middle of a massive humanitarian crisis, and these are the deals getting signed. It just screamed cronyism. Okay, so that's the argument for disaster capitalism. And it's a powerful one, but it is, without a doubt, a very controversial theory. So now we have to look at the other side. But is this really the whole story? One of the strongest counterarguments comes from the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank. They published this paper, The Klein Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Polemics, where they basically take on the entire shock doctrine thesis point by point. And it really comes down to this fundamental disagreement. On one side, you have Klein's thesis, which paints Milton Friedman as the intellectual godfather of this ruthless strategy, using crisis to force unpopular policies on people. On the other side, you have the Cato Institute, who calls that a malevolent distortion. They argue that no, Friedman was actually a huge advocate for peace and democracy, that he condemned dictatorships, and that he actually preferred gradual, steady reforms, not shock therapy. So wherever you land on that debate, there's a modern arena where these ideas feel incredibly relevant right now. And that's the growing business of profiting from climate chaos. Researchers have identified this really troubling business model they call the dual profiteering loop. And it works like this. Step 1, a big investment firm, like a private equity fund, invests in and profits from fossil fuel projects, the very things contributing to climate change. Step 2, that same firm goes out and buys up disaster cleanup and restoration companies. So step 3, they profit again from rebuilding the communities that are devastated by the very disasters their other investments helped create. It's a perfect circle. You profit from the cause, and you profit from the effect. And make no mistake, this isn't some niche strategy. Private equity is pouring into the space. Just look at the numbers. They've acquired 72 disaster cleanup firms since just 2020. And the pace is actually picking up. What used to be an industry of, small, local, family-owned businesses is quickly being gobbled up and consolidated by Wall Street. But behind all this money, there is a very real human cost. The people actually doing this brutal cleanup work, they're sometimes called resilience workers, are very often immigrants and refugees. They're a mobile workforce going from one disaster zone to the next. And according to labor rights groups, things like wage-staffed and incredibly unsafe conditions are just rampant. In fact, OSHA records show nearly 200 safety violations at these private equity-owned firms between 2015 and 2022. We're talking about workers being exposed to asbestos, toxic chemicals, and unstable buildings, often with little to no protection. So when you take all this together, from Iraq to our own hurricane-ravaged coasts, what's the big picture? What's the end result? Well, it leads to something that critics call the hollow state. And what that means is you have a government that has basically outsourced its most essential functions, things like national defense and, yes, disaster relief, to private for-profit contractors. You get this revolving door where government officials leave to join the boards of these companies and vice versa, which just blurs the line and makes accountability almost impossible. And what you're left with is this permanent disaster capitalism complex, an entire industry that actually profits from an endless cycle of crisis. And while it gets stronger, the public's ability to actually manage these disasters for itself just erodes away. And that leaves us with a really fundamental question, one we all have to think about. When disaster strikes, and it will, who should be in charge of rebuilding? Should it be the public square, a core function of a government acting for its people? Or should it be the private market, an opportunity for companies to step in and compete? How we answer that question doesn't just decide how we put things back together. It really decides what kind of society we want to be when the storm passes.
So while markets rise and fall, systems like this quietly move billions behind the scenes, hidden from the public, hidden from scrutiny, and sometimes hidden from the law itself. Because in global finance, the most powerful forces are rarely the most visible. And this is just one of the systems used by the unseen elite.